My 51-year-old dad introduced his 19-year-old girlfriend as the lady of the house, and then told me to respect her authority, and then demanded I keep paying the mortgage I co-signed, so I smiled, nodded, and then quietly handed her the $450,000 debt he thought I'd carry forever alone now. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm in Houston, Texas, and I'm telling you right now, if you've ever watched a parent pick a new partner over their own kid and then act like you're the unreasonable one, you're going to feel this in your teeth, because my dad didn't just date a teenager. He tried to turn her into my supervisor, and then he expected me to keep paying the mortgage like I was some silent ATM with feelings he could mute whenever it was convenient. And the crazy part is I almost let him, because that's what happens when you grow up being trained to be the bigger person until you realize bigger person is just code for easy target. The day it started, it wasn't dramatic music and thunder. It was a normal Saturday with a kind of heat that makes your steering wheel feel like a frying pan, and I was driving to my dad's place because he had texted, "Come over." Family meeting. That wording alone made my stomach go cold, because in my family meeting has never meant family. It's meant a decision has already been made, and now they're going to explain why you should be grateful. I pulled into the driveway and stared at the house for a second. The same beige stucco box I grew up in, the one I helped keep afloat after my mom passed, and I swear the house looked like it was holding its breath, like it knew it was about to watch something ugly. When I walked in, the air smelled like new candle and cheap vanilla perfume, and that was my first clue, because my dad hates candles. He says they're girly, which should have been my second clue that this wasn't about a leaky faucet or an insurance bill. Then I heard her laugh, a high little giggle from the kitchen, like a TikTok sound effect come to life, and then my dad stepped into the hallway grinning like he'd won a prize at a carnival. "There you are," he said, "too cheerful, too ready. I want you to meet someone." I took my shoes off out of habit, and then I looked up, and there she was, leaning against the counter in a satin top, nails perfect, lashes perfect, lips glossy, like she had just finished filming Get Ready With Me in my childhood kitchen. And I remember this stupid detail that made me want to laugh and gag at the same time. She was wearing a little gold necklace with a letter L, and I thought, either that's her name, or that's a warning label. "This is Lila," my dad said, arms sliding around her waist like he was trying to prove something to the walls. "She's special." Lila smiled at me like I was a customer at a store she worked at for one summer and hated. "Hi," she said, dragging it out, eyes scanning me from shoes to face like she was evaluating whether I matched the furniture. I said, "Hey," and I try to keep my face neutral, because I'm not the type to attack a stranger. I'm the type to collect information and then decide what to do with it, and at that point, I still thought the problem was going to be my dad's midlife crisis, not my bank account. He clapped his hands, once like a coach. "All right," he said, "sit. We're doing this like adults." That's rich, I thought, because the only adult in the room besides me was him, and he was acting like a teenager who just discovered attention. We sat at the dining table, the same one my mom used to polish every Sunday, and I noticed there were papers stacked neatly by his elbow, and my throat tightened, because papers in my family mean money, and money in my family means manipulation dressed up as responsibility. My dad cleared his throat and said, "So, Lila's going to be staying here." He said it like he was announcing a new TV show. I blinked. "Okay," I said carefully. "For how long?" Lila answered before he did, and this is where my brain started lighting up like a dashboard. "As long as it makes sense," she said, and then she looked at my dad for approval like she'd just said something wise. My dad nodded proudly. "She's moving in," he said, "and I need you to be respectful." The way he said it, you'd think I had already been disrespectful, like I had thrown a drink in her face, when all I had done was exist with eyebrows. I said, "Respectful how?" And he leaned back and smiled like he'd practiced this part. "She's the lady of the house now," he said, and there was a pause afterward like he expected applause. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, and when it didn't come, my mouth did something on its own. "The what?" I said. Lila lifted her chin, and my dad repeated it slower, like I was the one struggling with vocabulary. "The lady of the house," he said. "She keeps things running. Schedules. Rules. You know. Household." The words hit me one by one, like thrown pennies. Schedules. Rules. Household. And then he looked at me and added, "You've been a little too comfortable acting like this is still your place." And that sentence right there is when the movie inside my head cut to old scenes I didn't ask to replay. Me at 25 signing papers I barely understood because my dad said, "It's just to help qualify." Me working overtime and sending him money for property taxes because he said the house was in danger. Me skipping vacations, skipping new clothes, skipping life because I was helping family. And then I looked at the teenager in my kitchen and realized my dad wasn't just changing his love life. He was changing the power structure, and he wanted me to stay underneath it while still paying for the roof. I took a slow breath and said, "Dad, I don't live here." And he waved a hand like that fact was inconvenient. "You don't live here," he agreed, "but you still come around. And you still have opinions. And honestly, it's confusing for Lila."
Confusing.
Like I was a stray dog that kept returning to the porch. Lila jumped in again, smiling sweet like poison. "I just think it's important," she said, "that we have boundaries. Like, if you're going to drop by, you should text first. And also, I'd appreciate it if you didn't go into the master area." The master area. She called my parents' bedroom the master area like it was a hotel suite. I felt my eyebrows climb. "I don't go into your master area," I said, and she shrugged like she didn't fully believe me. My dad sighed and tapped the stack of papers. "Look," he said, switching tones, "this doesn't have to be dramatic." That line is always the warning that drama is exactly what they're about to serve you. "I called you here because we need to talk about the mortgage," he said, and there it was, the real reason, the hook under the bait. My stomach dropped. "What about it?"
I asked.
He slid one paper toward me, and I recognized my own name before I recognized anything else. My signature.
The date.
The co-signer line. The thing I had done because he told me, "It's temporary and it helps us get a better rate." He said, "The mortgage is going up. Rates changed. Escrow changed. Whatever. The payment's higher." I said, "So refinance." And he smiled like I was adorable. "We can't," he said, and Lila made a little pouty face like the mortgage had personally insulted her. "Why can't you?" I asked, already knowing the answer was going to be some mess. Dad rubbed his forehead and said, "Because the bank is asking questions. About income. About stability. They don't like change." And then I watched him do it. The casual pivot. The guilt pivot. He looked at Lila and then looked back at me and said, "So, I need you to keep covering your portion for now." My portion. Like this was a group project. I stared at him. "My portion?" I repeated. "Dad, I don't live here, and I already help." He spread his hands. "You're on the paperwork," he said, "so, yeah, it's your responsibility." I swear to you, something in me went very quiet. Not calm. Not peace. More like when you hear a car door lock click in the dark. That quiet. Because he wasn't asking. He was declaring. He was treating my name like handcuffs. Lila leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said, "It's really not that big of a deal. Like, you're older, you have a career, you can handle it." I stared at her and thought, "You're 19, and you just told me to handle a $500,000 debt like it's a parking ticket." My dad nodded like she'd spoken scripture. "Exactly," he said. "You can handle it. You've always been responsible." And there it was, the family slogan. Responsible. Translation. You will sacrifice, and we will call it maturity. I asked, "And what are you handling?" And my dad's face tightened. "I'm handling the house," he snapped, and Lila added, "And I'm handling the home." She said it like she deserved a sash. I laughed once, but it wasn't funny laughter. It was disbelief laughter, and my dad immediately got offended, because manipulators hate when you refuse to play the script. "What's so funny?" he demanded. I leaned in slightly and said, "Dad, you're telling me your teenage girlfriend is the lady of the house, but I'm the one who has to pay for it." Lila's smile dropped for a second, and then she recovered with that fake patience people use when they want to call you crazy without saying the word. "No," she said, "I'm saying respect matters, and your attitude is digressive." Aggressive. I looked at my dad. So let me get this straight. I said, you want me to keep paying the mortgage and also take orders from someone who can't legally rent a car? My dad stood up so fast his chair scraped, and that sound made my chest jump. Don't disrespect her, he barked, finger pointed like I was 14 again. She's not a kid. She's an adult. Lila sat back, satisfied, like she'd just watched him pass a loyalty test. And in that moment, I realized my dad wasn't just dating her, he was auditioning for her. He was performing manhood. He was making me the villain, so she could feel like the prize. I swallowed, because part of me wanted to explode, and part of me knew exploding would be exactly what they'd used to paint me as unstable, emotional, jealous. So, I did something scarier. I got quiet. I nodded slowly. Okay, I said. My dad exhaled like he'd won. Lila smirked like she'd won too. And then I asked, so, what does lady of the house mean, exactly? Lila's eyes brightened because she thought I was submitting. It means, she said, counting on her fingers, no showing up unannounced, no questioning decisions, and you need to stop acting like you own the place. Own the place. The words almost made me choke because I didn't own it, not legally, not emotionally, not even spiritually, but I had been paying for it like a fool, and my name was on the debt like a tattoo. My dad nodded along and added, and if Lila says something needs to be done around here, you don't argue. You just cooperate. Cooperate. He said it like I was a co-worker. I looked at the papers again, and I noticed something in the corner of the stack, a sticky note with numbers, and my brain did math without permission. $450,000. That was the remaining mortgage balance. Seeing it written down made it real in a new way, like finding out the monster has a name and your address. My palms went damp. I asked, when did you even meet her? And my dad waved it off.
A few months ago, he said.
It's not your business. Lila chimed in, we met at the gym, and she laughed like that explained everything, and then she added, your dad is so misunderstood. I get him. That sentence right there made me see red, because if you've ever watched someone brand new walk into your family's mess and act like they understand the main character better than you do, you know the rage. I forced a small smile and said, you get him. And then I looked at my dad and asked, does she know I co-signed the mortgage? Lila's smile froze for half a second, and that told me she didn't know details. She knew vibes.
My dad jumped in fast.
She doesn't need to know the paperwork, he said, protective. Not of me. Of her image of him. Because he wants to be the provider in her story, not the guy who tethered his kid to a debt. I nodded again. Right, I said. So she's the lady of the house, but she doesn't need to know how the house is paid for. Lila's nostrils flared. My dad slammed his palm on the table. Enough, he snapped. You're going to ruin this. I'm happy. For once, I'm happy. That line, for once, I'm happy, it was supposed to guilt me, and it almost did because I'm not heartless. I want people to be happy, but then I remembered how my happiness never counted when it cost him effort. I remembered asking him for help after my mom died and him saying, you're strong. You'll figure it out. Funny how you'll figure it out always lands on the same person. I inhaled, slow, and I said, Dad, I want you happy. But you don't get happiness by handing me your consequences. And then he said the most insulting thing he could have said because it was designed to put me back in my place. He said, this is why you're still single. Like my relationship status was proof I deserved disrespect. Lila's mouth twitched like she wanted to laugh, but didn't want to look mean in front of him. I stared at my father and thought, wow, you really will throw anything at me if it keeps your fantasy alive. I stood up, smoothing my shirt, acting calm even though my heart was doing that painful thudding thing. Okay, I said, I hear you. Dad's shoulders dropped like he thought the fight was over. Lila crossed her arms like she'd established dominance. And then I did something that felt like stepping off a cliff. I said, before I go, I want to see the mortgage statement and the payment history. Just so I understand what I'm paying. My dad's eyes narrowed. Why? He asked. Because I'm on the hook, I said. Adults handle paperwork, remember? Lila rolled her eyes. It's boring, she muttered. I ignored her. Dad hesitated, and that hesitation was a confession. Then he said, "I'll send it." I nodded. "No," I said, still polite. "I'd rather see it now." My dad's jaw tightened. He hated that. He hated me asking for receipts. Because receipts turn guilt into facts. He walked to the office, and I followed, and Lila followed too, because she didn't trust any conversation she wasn't controlling. In the office, my dad pulled up his laptop, clicking too hard, and I noticed the desk, my mother's old desk, now covered with cologne samples and a new photo frame with him and Lila at some restaurant, her lips on his cheek, him smiling like a teenager who'd gotten chosen for prom. I swallowed the disgust, focused on the screen. He opened the mortgage portal and the numbers popped up, and there it was again, the balance, the payment, the escrow, and then I saw the late fees column, and my stomach flipped. Late fees. Multiple. Not huge, but frequent. Meaning he hadn't been paying on time consistently, meaning this mortgage increase story wasn't the full story. I pointed. "What's that?" I asked. My dad closed the tab too fast. "Nothing," he said. I looked at him. Late fees aren't nothing. Lila stepped closer behind him, peering at the screen, and I watched her face change when she realized there was an adult problem here, not just a vibe problem. "Babe," she said softly. First time she sounded unsure. Dad snapped. "It's handled." I held up a hand. "No," I said. "It's not handled. It's being hidden. And if my name is tied to this, I'm not playing blind anymore." My dad tried to stare me down. "You're overreacting," he said. That word again. Overreacting, the favorite tool of people who want you quiet. I took a slow breath and said, "Let me ask you something and be honest. If I stop paying, what happens?" He opened his mouth, and nothing came out for a beat too long. That beat said everything. Lila's eyes flicked to him, then to me, then back, like she was watching a tennis match she didn't sign up for. My dad finally said, "We'll figure it out." There it is again. "We'll figure it out." The same line he used on me, but now it was we, meaning me again. I nodded once and said, "Okay." And right here, mid-story, I need you to tell me something because I know the comments are going to split into two tribes. If you were me, would you keep paying just to protect your credit, or would you cut them off and let the consequences teach the lesson? And while you're thinking, drop where you're watching from, city and country, because I want to see how many of us have lived some version of this in completely different places. I walked out of the office with my face calm and my mind racing, and as I grabbed my keys from the counter, Lila called after me, "Sweet again. Rehearsed again." "No hard feelings," she said. "We're all family now." I turned back slowly and looked her dead in the eye and said, "Family doesn't come with invoices." My dad barked my name like a warning. "Ethan," I said, using his first name on purpose because it snapped him out of the "I'm your father, so obey" fantasy. "I'm going to review my options." He stepped forward. "Options?" he repeated. "Don't threaten me." I smiled politely. "I'm not threatening you," I said. "I'm informing you." Then I walked out, and the second I got into my car, my hands started shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, because I realized I had been walking around with a financial grenade for years, and I was the only one careful enough not to drop it, and they were treating my caution like weakness. I sat there in the driveway and watched the curtains move in the front window, meaning Lila was watching me leave like I was a problem she wanted gone, and then my phone buzzed, a text from my dad. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." And that right there made me laugh, one sharp breath of laughter, because he said it like I was the complication, not the fact that he brought a teenager into a cosign mortgage situation and tried to crown her queen of a house she didn't pay for. I drove home, and the whole way, my brain kept replaying one phrase: Lady of the House. Lady of the House. Like a title you can hand someone when you don't want to do the emotional work of being a decent parent. When I got home, I didn't pour wine, I didn't call friends, I didn't scream into a pillow. I did the one thing manipulators hate most. I opened my laptop and I started pulling every document I could find, every email, every statement, every signature, and then I discovered one detail buried in the paperwork that made my throat go dry, because it meant my dad wasn't just reckless, he'd been strategically reckless. And if I didn't move fast, I wasn't just going to get disrespected, I was going to get financially buried, and the worst part is, the person he'd put in charge of the house had no idea what kind of collapse she had. just moved into. I got home, kicked my shoes off, and then I did that thing you only do when your nervous system is screaming but your brain refuses to panic. I opened every folder, every email thread, every banking app, every old text message search because my gut kept saying, this isn't just disrespect, this is a trap, and I needed facts before feelings. So I made tea I didn't drink, sat at my kitchen table under the harsh overhead light, and typed my dad's name into my email search bar, like I was looking for proof in a crime documentary, and the first thing that popped up was the original mortgage approval packet from 5 years ago, the one I signed after my mom died, back when my dad still had the decency to look sad instead of smug. And I remember the exact day because it was raining and he had talked like a man who was trying to keep his family from drowning. He'd said, I just need your help to qualify. And then once things stabilize, we'll refinance and take you off. And I believed him. Because I was grieving and because he said it like a promise, and grief makes you sign things you would normally interrogate. And as I open the packet now, years later, I felt my stomach tighten because the language looked different when you're not desperate. It looked colder, more final, and then I saw it, the detail I had missed back then, because I wasn't reading like a strategist, I was reading like a daughter. And the detail was a single sentence in the cosigner section that basically said the quiet part out loud. I wasn't just a backup. I was fully responsible for the debt if he didn't pay, not morally, legally. And then I scrolled down to the signature block and saw my name, crisp and innocent, next to his. And I had this weird flash of myself sitting in that bank office with a pen that kept slipping because my hands were sweaty, and the loan guy had said, this is standard. And my dad had squeezed my shoulder like I was his hero. And now I realized he didn't squeeze my shoulder because he loved me, he squeezed it because he got what he wanted. I pulled up the mortgage portal again, the one he tried to close too quickly in front of Lila, and I logged in using the credentials I still had because I was listed as the co-borrower, and the portal opened like a mouth, showing me the payment history, and my chest got tight because the late fees weren't random, they were patterned like clockwork, always after the 15th, always after some other expense must have hit. And then I looked at the escrow breakdown, and saw something that made me blink hard. The homeowner's insurance had been changed 3 times in 2 years, and every time it changed, the premium went up. And I know some people will say insurance goes up all the time. Sure, but 3 changes like that isn't normal. It's someone shopping around because they're struggling or because they're hiding something. And then I clicked into the tax section and saw a notation about a delinquency notice from last year that had been cleared, and my throat went dry because I remembered my dad calling me in a calm voice last year saying, hey, can you float me a little extra this month, just temporary, the county is being weird, and I had sent it no questions because I was still playing the old role. Then my phone buzzed with a text from my dad. Don't talk to anyone about this. We're handling it privately. That text alone told me there was already a story being built. Because normal people don't say don't talk to anyone unless they know they're wrong, and I felt that familiar pull to obey, the old training, the family conditioning, and then I felt something else rise underneath it, a new muscle, the kind you build after you've been used too many times, and I typed back one sentence. I'm reviewing the loan terms and my legal options. I didn't add emoji. I didn't add softness. I didn't add love you. I kept it dry like paperwork. He didn't reply for 10 minutes. Which is forever for someone like him, and then he called. I let it ring 3 times because I needed my hand steady, and when I answered, he didn't say hi, he didn't ask how I was, he went straight for control. What are you doing? He snapped, and I could hear Lila in the background laughing at something on her phone, like this was just another day in her content timeline. I said, I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. Acting like an adult. He made this annoyed exhale, the one he uses when he wants to frame you as difficult. You're being dramatic, he said, and I could feel my jaw clench because manipulative people love that word, dramatic. It's how they paint your boundaries as hysteria. I said, I saw the late fees, the tax notice, and the insurance changes. You didn't mention any of that. You just told me the payment went up and your girlfriend is the lady of the house. Silence for half a beat, and then his voice got sharper. Don't talk about her like that, he said. She's not my girlfriend. She's my partner. Partner. The word almost made me laugh again because he said it like a weapon, like upgrading the label upgrades the morality. I said, Ethan, she's 19. He barked, stop obsessing about her age. And right there, I almost lost it because that's what people say when the age is the problem. I kept my tone flat and said, I'm not obsessing. I'm stating a fact that matters when you're putting her in a position of authority over a home I'm financially tied to. He snapped. You're not tied to it. You're choosing to be involved. I said, my name is on the mortgage. That is literally tied. He tried a new angle, and I could hear him switching gears like a car transmission. Look, he said, suddenly softer. I'm sorry if the note or whatever made you feel disrespected. The note. The note he didn't even tell me about, the one he was basically trying to force with lady of the house rules. He said, but you have to understand, you've been acting like you still run things. I said, I don't run things. I just don't want to get buried under your choices. He sighed like I was exhausting. This is why I didn't want to tell you, he muttered, and that sentence hit me harder than the yelling because it exposed the truth. He hides information from me because I'm the one person who can block him. I said, tell me what? He paused, and then his voice lowered, like he was admitting something without wanting to admit it. I fell behind a bit, he said, but I caught up. It's fine. I said, how far behind? He snapped, why do you need to know? I said, because my credit is on the line. He went quiet, and then he said, 2 months. 2 months. That's not a bit. That's a crisis. That's the kind of thing that turns into foreclosure letters and lawsuits and wrecked credit scores. My hands went cold. I said, 2 months behind and you're introducing a teenager like she's management. He yelled, stop calling her a teenager. I said, stop acting like this is normal. Lila's voice floated in the background, loud enough for me to hear, babe, just tell her she's being weird. And I swear to you, hearing a 19-year-old call me weird for refusing to bankroll her lifestyle, something in me clicked into full clarity. I said, put her on the phone. My dad said, no, I said, put her on the phone. He said, why? I said, because if she's the lady of the house, she should understand the house. There was shuffling, a muffled argument, and then Lila came on, voice sweet and sharp at the same time. Hello, she said, like she was answering a customer complaint. I said, hi, Lila. Quick question. Do you know the mortgage balance on that house? She laughed. Why would I know that? I said, because you're the lady of the house. Her laugh died fast. That's not what that means, she snapped. I said, what does it mean then? She said, it means I manage the home environment. I said, okay. The home environment is $450,000 of debt with late fees, tax warnings, and a cosigner you're trying to boss around. That is the environment. She got quiet, and then she tried the classic deflection. This is between you and your dad, she said. I said, no. You inserted yourself. You set rules. You told me to handle it. So I'm asking you directly. Are you paying any part of that mortgage? She scoffed. Obviously not. Obviously not. Like that was the most natural thing in the world. I said, so you're not paying, but you're in charge. She snapped. It's his house. I said, it's his house emotionally, but it's my house legally too, because my name is on it. She said, that's your choice. I said, it was my choice when my mother died and my father asked me for help like he was drowning. The word mother changed the air. I could feel it even through the phone, like reality pushed its way back into the room, and Lila didn't like it. She said, I don't know your family trauma, okay? But I'm not trying to fight. I said, then stop giving orders. She went quiet again, and then she said something that made my eyes narrow because it revealed her whole mentality. I just think you're jealous, she said, and she said it like she had discovered the obvious explanation. Jealous of a 19-year-old playing house with my dad while I pay the bills. I laughed once low. Jealous, I repeated. Lila, I'm not jealous. I'm alarmed. She snapped, whatever. I'm not talking about money with you. I said, then don't talk about authority with me. And then I heard my dad in the background, taking the phone back, whispering angrily, and then he came back on and said, you're not going to interrogate her. I said, I'm not interrogating her. I'm reality checking her. He barked, enough. Are you paying or not? There it was. The real question. Are you paying or not? Not are you okay, not can we fix this, just are you still useful? I felt my throat tighten, but my voice stayed calm. I'm not paying another dollar until I see a full accounting, I said. And I'm not talking about your scribbled sticky note math. I want the last 12 months of statements. I want proof where every payment came from. And I want to know why insurance changed 3 times. He exploded. You don't get to audit me, he shouted. I said, yes, I do. My name is on the loan. He hissed. If you do this, you're going to ruin us. I said, no, you ruined you. I'm just refusing to be the cushion you land on. He said, after everything I've done for you. That one. The favorite.
The martyr line.
I said, list it. He froze. I said, list everything you've done for me financially in the last 5 years. Silence. Actual silence. Then he said, I'm your father. I said, that's a title, not a receipt. He muttered something under his breath that I'm not going to repeat because it was ugly, and then he said, fine. Do what you want. But don't come crying to me when the bank comes after you too. That threat was supposed to scare me back into obedience, but it did the opposite, because it confirmed he knew the risk and still used me. I said, that's exactly why I'm doing this, and I hung up before he could twist my words. The next 2 hours, I moved like a person possessed, not by anger, by focus. I pulled my credit reports. I checked if any new accounts had been opened in my name. I searched the county property records to see if any liens existed. I found the deed, and I stared at the ownership section. And here's the part that made my stomach flip. The deed was only in my dad's name, but the mortgage had my name too, which meant I had liability without ownership, the worst possible combination, like being forced to pay for a car you're not allowed to drive. And I sat there blinking at the screen thinking, I cannot believe I let this happen. Then I did something that felt terrifying but necessary. I called the mortgage servicer myself. I asked what options a co-borrower has when the primary borrower is delinquent. I kept my voice polite, calm, professional, like I was calling about a cable bill, because the person on the other end doesn't care about your pain, they care about process. The representative confirmed the delinquency timeline, confirmed the fees, confirmed the risk, and then said a sentence that made my skin go cold. If the account continues to delinquency, we report it on all borrowers' credit files. All borrowers.
Me.
My future. My ability to buy a home, get a car, rent an apartment, everything. I thanked them, hung up, and stared at my wall for a full minute, because I realized this wasn't just about teaching my dad a lesson, it was about saving myself from a sinking ship that my dad kept punching holes into because he thought I'd keep bailing water forever. Then I got an email notification, and I swear it felt like a drumbeat in a horror movie. It was from my dad. Subject line, House Rules. He had attached a PDF. A PDF. Like he was HR. I opened it, and my mouth actually fell open because it wasn't just rules like text before coming, it was power play rules. Visits must be scheduled 48 hours in advance. No entering private areas. No discussing finances with Lila. All concerns must be addressed through Ethan. And my favorite, the one that made my blood boil. Failure to comply will result in removal from the property and further action. Further action. He was threatening me with action in a house I was legally tied to, while also telling me I was not allowed to talk about finances with the person he crowned as queen. My hands shook, and I had one of those juicy, neurotic thoughts you don't say out loud because it sounds insane, but I'm going to say it because it's real. I thought he's trying to set up a narrative where I look like the unstable ex-wife, the jealous daughter, the intruder, so when he defaults and the bank comes, he can tell everyone I abandoned him. And then I thought, and then what if he tries to claim I agreed to all this and I'm still responsible? And then I thought, and then what if? He's already planning to marry her and shove me deeper into the mess. And then I realized I wasn't just in a family conflict. I was in a chess game with someone who thinks love is leverage. So I took a screenshot of the PDF, saved it in 3 places, emailed it to myself, and then I wrote one reply, one sentence. Any changes to access or rules will be discussed after full financial disclosure and legal review. And then my phone started blowing up, call after call after call, And I didn't answer because I needed to decide my next move like a grown woman, not like a daughter begging for a dad to act right. Later that night, as I was brushing my teeth, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped because it was a photo of my signature page from the mortgage packet, zoomed in like a threat, with one line of text underneath. Remember what you signed. And in that moment, I realized someone inside that house was no longer just disrespecting me, they were trying to intimidate me, and that meant the next step wasn't emotional, it was strategic, because when people start sending you evidence like a warning, it's because they're planning to use it against you, and I knew exactly what I had to do next, but it meant walking straight back into that house, looking the so-called lady of the house in the eye, and handing her something she thought she'd never touch: responsibility. By the time I got home that night, my hands were still shaking, not from fear, from the kind of anger that makes you eerily calm, like your body has decided it's done begging and it's switching to math. I stood in my kitchen in Atlanta with the fridge humming and my phone buzzing on the counter, and I kept replaying that sentence. She's the lady of the house. Not my girlfriend. Not someone I'm seeing. Lady of
The house.
like I was a guest in a home I'd been paying for. Like I hadn't spent years paying bills on time, skipping vacations, turning down cute little treat-yourself moments because I was trying to be responsible and keep the family afloat after my mom died and my dad started needing help. And then my phone lit up again, and it wasn't him. It was her, the 19-year-old. Her name wasn't Lila in real life, but for this story, we're calling her Lila because it fits the vibe of someone who wears lip gloss like armor. The text said, "Hey, can you grab groceries on your way tomorrow? Mr. Carter said you usually do. Also, don't forget almond milk. I don't do dairy." I stared at the screen like it was a prank show. Mr. Carter. Like he was her boss, not my father. Like I was the intern. I didn't reply. I didn't type. I just sat on the edge of my couch and let the silence do what it does when you finally stop filling it with excuses. Because I realized something ugly. This wasn't just about disrespect. This was about ownership,
Power.
paperwork, the kind of betrayal that hides inside family conversations and then shows up later wearing a suit and holding a pen. So I did what I always do when my emotions get too loud. I went hunting for facts. I pulled out my folder, the boring one I keep under the TV stand, the one labeled house. Inside were the mortgage statements, the insurance, the property tax letters, and the closing documents I hadn't opened in years because, honestly, it felt like trauma paperwork. I started flipping pages like I was looking for a hidden message. And then I found it. The promissory note. The signature page. And right there, on the line where the borrower signs, was my name. Not as a resident. Not as next of kin. As a borrower. Co-borrower. The kind of signature that doesn't just say, "I live here." It says, "If this goes sideways, you drown too." My stomach dropped so hard I actually put my hand over my mouth like I was going to be sick. Because I remembered that day now, the day we refinanced. My dad had been all soft voice and sad eyes, doing that "I'm just a tired man" act. He'd said, "Baby, help me out. Rates are crazy. I'm getting older. We just need to refinance so the payment is lower." He'd brought me papers in a folder and pointed where I should sign, and I signed because I was grieving and I trusted my dad, and he made it sound like I was signing to confirm I'd seen the documents, not signing to marry myself to a debt. And I remember asking, "Why is my name on this?" And him laughing like I was silly. "It's just the bank being cautious. You live here. It's normal." Normal. That word will ruin you if you let it. I sat there in my living room, staring at my own signature like it belonged to a stranger. And I had this thought that honestly made me laugh, like a short, sharp laugh that didn't match my face at all. "So you're telling me my father didn't just bring a teenager into the house. He brought her into a house he legally tied me to, and then he announced her as lady of the house like he was crowning her on my dime." And then the next thought hit. If I'm legally tied to this mortgage, then I'm not powerless. I'm not just the daughter. I'm not the help. I'm part of the paperwork. And paperwork is the only language people like my dad actually respect. So the next morning, I didn't call him screaming. I didn't send a paragraph text. I did something colder. I called the mortgage servicer. Not to complain. Not to beg. To ask questions. The woman on the phone had that professional smile in her voice, and I kept my tone polite because polite gets you more than angry ever will. Hi, I said. I'm listed on the loan. I need to understand my options and my responsibilities. She verified me, asked security questions, and then she said the number that made my chest tighten. The remaining balance was just under $450,000. $450,000. That's not a family favor. That's a lifetime. That's years of your life converted into a monthly bill. And then she explained something that made my skin go cold. If the loan went into default, they could come after either borrower, me included. Meaning my dad could wreck my credit, my future, my ability to ever buy my own place, and he could do it while telling a teenager to order almond milk like she was running the estate. I thanked the woman, asked for copies of the loan documents, and requested the full payment history. Then I made a second call to a real estate attorney. Her name was Ms. Daniels, and she sounded like she'd been disappointed in men for a living for at least 20 years. I gave her the quick version, and she didn't gasp, didn't do the "oh honey" thing. She just said, "Okay, here's what matters. Are you on the deed or only on the loan?" And that question made my blood pressure jump because I realized I didn't even know. Imagine paying for a house you might not even legally own. I pulled out the deed paperwork, searched the county site, and there it was. The deed listed my dad only. Not me. The loan had my name, the ownership didn't. So basically, I was the mule carrying the weight, while he held the title and handed the keys to whoever he wanted. Ms. Daniels went quiet for a second, then said, "That's convenient for him." And I said, "That's the nicest way anyone has described my father in the last 24 hours. She told me my options, and the options were all different flavors of unfair, but at least they were real. I could sue to force a sale. I could negotiate a refinance that removes me, but that would require him qualifying without my income. I could pursue a claim that I was misled into signing. I could also, and this part made my heart beat faster, stop paying anything beyond what I was legally required to, and let reality squeeze him the way he'd been squeezing me. Because here's the truth that people don't say out loud. Sometimes the only way to get a manipulator to stop is to remove their safety net. And I had been his safety net for years. I thanked Ms. Daniels and scheduled an in-person meeting. Then I did something else. I pulled up my bank app and looked at the automatic payments I had set up, not just for the mortgage but for the utilities and the maintenance account and the little house cushion savings I'd been feeding every month because my dad always had some emergency. I turned off every single autopay that was tied to that house except the minimum I needed to protect myself in the short term. I wasn't going to let him miss payments and trash my credit out of spite, but I also wasn't going to keep funding his fantasy lifestyle and his teenage lady of the house. Then I opened my notes app and started writing down the timeline like a detective. When we refinanced, what he told me, how much I'd paid, the date he moved her in, the exact words he used in the kitchen, the way she'd looked at me like I was the maid. Because I learned something the hard way. Feelings don't hold up in court, but dates do. Receipts do. Exact wording does. And then, because I'm petty in the healthiest way, I printed screenshots of Lila's text messages. The ones where she ordered groceries. The ones where she said, "Mr. Carter." The ones where she talked like she had authority. Not because I needed to prove she was annoying, but because it showed the dynamic. My father had positioned her as the boss and me as the labor, in a house I was financially tied to. That's not just disrespect, it's exploitation with eyeliner on top.
2 days later, my dad called me.
Not angry.
Sweet. Which is how you know someone's about to ask for something.
"Hey, baby," he said. "You been avoiding us?"
Us.
Like they were a married couple. I said, "I've been busy."
He laughed.
"Lila says you seemed stressed. You should relax. We're doing family dinner tonight. She's making pasta." And I swear to you, the audacity almost impressed me. Because the man really said that like she'd been here long enough to have traditions. I said, "I'm not coming to dinner." His voice tightened slightly. "Why not?" And I said, "Because I have questions about the house." Silence. A longer silence than normal. The kind where you can hear someone's brain trying to find the right lie. He finally said, "What questions?" I said, "The kind that require documents and not vibes." He did that little chuckle again. "Baby, you worry too much." And right there, that sentence, that's how people steal from you. They call your awareness worry. They call your boundaries attitude. They call your questions drama. I said, "I'm coming by tomorrow at 6. We need to talk. You, me, and Lila." "Why does she need to be there?" he asked quickly. And I said, "Because she's the lady of the house, right?" That landed. I could hear his breath shift. "Don't start," he warned, and I said, "I'm not starting anything. I'm ending something." That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was scared of the conversation, but because I kept thinking about every time I'd covered for him. Every time I told myself he was lonely. Every time I ignored the gut feeling that something was off. Every time I let him use the word family like a discount coupon. And I kept imagining Grace, my little cousin who's 13, growing up watching this and thinking this is normal. That women take the hit while men rewrite the story. And I promised myself, quietly, that I wasn't going to teach the next girl in this family to swallow disrespect just because it comes from an older man with dad in his contact name. The next day at 5:55, I pulled up outside the house. I sat in my car for a second, looking at the porch light, the wreath still hanging even though it was January, and I realized I wasn't nervous anymore. I was clear. That's the scariest version of a woman, by the way, not the angry one, the clear one. I grabbed my folder, the one with copies of the loan, the payment history, the deed, the attorney's card, and one extra thing I printed that morning. A single page that showed the exact amount I had paid into that house over the last 5 years, broken down month by month. I walked in, and there she was on the couch, Lila, legs tucked under her, wearing one of my dad's hoodies like it was a trophy. She looked up and smiled like we were friends. "Hey," she said, "we were just about to eat." My dad came out of the kitchen with that performative calm, wiping his hands on a towel. "What's all this?" he asked, nodding at the folder. I didn't sit down. I didn't take my coat off. I placed the folder on the coffee table like I was dropping evidence, because I was. And I said, "Since you made her the lady of the house, I figured she should know what comes with the title." Lila's smile froze. My dad's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" he asked low, like he was trying to intimidate me back into being obedient. I looked at him and said, "I'm making sure the lady of the house understands the house." And then I opened the folder to the signature page and slid it across the table toward her first, not him, her, because if she wanted the crown, she could wear the weight too, and I watched her eyes drop to the numbers, and the room got so quiet I could hear the kitchen clock ticking like a countdown, and then she whispered, "For 150,000? And my dad said, way too fast, "That's not her business." And I smiled, small and sharp, because he'd finally said the truth out loud. Without realizing it, and I said, "Funny, because she told me groceries were my business, so I thought we were all sharing responsibilities now." And then I leaned in just slightly and asked, "So tell me, Lila, do you still want to be the lady of the house when the first bill hits your name instead of your lip gloss?" Lila's eyes stayed glued to the paper like it was a horror movie and she couldn't look away, and my dad's face did that thing men do when they realize the story they've been narrating in their head is about to get fact-checked in public, and for one full second nobody spoke, not even the TV, because Lila had paused whatever little reality show was playing, and the only sound was the ceiling fan clicking like it was counting down to somebody's meltdown, and then my dad finally broke the silence. With a tight laugh that didn't reach his eyes, and he said, Okay, you're being dramatic, and I swear the word dramatic should come with a warning label because it's the favorite tool of people who benefit from you staying quiet." And I looked at him and said, "No, dramatic is a gender reveal party. This is a mortgage." And Lila's mouth opened like she was about to defend him, but nothing came out, because she didn't have a script for this part. She had a script for daughter is jealous, and girlfriend is sweet, and dad is misunderstood. But there's no cute angle when the number 450,000 is sitting there like a dead body on the coffee table. And my dad reached for the folder like he could close it and make reality disappear, and I slapped my hand down on it. Not hard, just firm, like putting a lid on boiling water, and I said, "Nope, we're not doing that thing where you hide paperwork and call it peace." And he stared at me like I'd just sworn at A. past her, and I could see him scanning for an exit, some way to flip it into me being disrespectful, and then he tried it. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and said, "You've always had a problem with me moving on." And I laughed, actually laughed, because that was so lazy, so predictable, and I said, "Sir, you could date a mermaid, I don't care, what I care about is you using my credit like it's a family subscription plan." And Lila blinked fast and said, "Wait, your credit?" And I turned to her and kept my voice calm because I wasn't mad at her the way I was mad at him. She's 19 and he's 51, the power difference is screaming, and I said, "Yeah, my name is on the loan, and if he misses payments, it hits me, and if he defaults, they come after me too." And I watched her face change from confident girlfriend to confused teenager in a hoodie, and she glanced at my dad like, "Is that true?" And my dad did not answer her. He looked at me and said, "I never asked you to pay anything." And I lifted my eyebrows like, "Are we lying for sport now?" And I said, "You didn't ask, you arranged, you're very good at arranging." And then I pulled out the page I'd printed with a payment breakdown and slid it across the table, because this wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about receipts, and the second he saw the totals, his jaw flexed because he knew the math. He knew I'd been covering gaps, utilities, repairs, temporary shortages that never ended. He knew I'd been subsidizing his life while he built a new one, and Lila leaned forward and whispered, "You've been paying?" And my dad snapped, "She lives here too?" And I said, "I don't live here, I don't even have a key anymore. You changed the locks 2 weeks ago and told me to stop barging in like I'm a stranger." And Lila's eyes widened because she didn't know that part. Of course she didn't. She only knew the version where I'm the bitter daughter who won't let her dad be happy. And I kept going because once you start telling the truth, it's hard to stop. You told me to call before coming by my own childhood home, then you gave her a key and told her she's the lady of the house. And Lila's cheeks flushed and she shot back, "He gave me a key because I live here." And I nodded like, "Exactly." And I said, "So let's talk about living here." And I pointed at the deed printout, the one from the county site, and I said, "This house is in his name only, but the loan is in both our names, which means he owns it, but I'm responsible for it." And Lila's brows pulled together in confusion, and she said, "Why would that be like set up that way?" And my dad tried to cut in with another dismissive line, "It's just how banks," and I cut him off, still calm. "No, it's how you set it up." And that's when the temperature in the room changed, because he realized I wasn't here to argue. I was here to reassign weight. And I turned my body toward Lila and said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly, okay? No shame, just honesty. Did he tell you that if he misses a payment, it can ruin my credit?" And Lila shook her head slowly. "No." And I said, "Did he tell you that I could be sued if he defaults?" And she whispered, "No." And I said, "Did he tell you he can't refinance without me?" And she looked at him again and her voice got small. "Can you?" And my dad's face tightened and he said, "That's between me and my daughter." And I said, "No. It's between me and the bank. You're just the one playing middleman." And Lila sat back like she'd been slapped, and I could see her trying to decide if she was being played or if this was some family drama she could ignore. And my dad leaned forward, voice low, "What do you want?" Like he was talking to a problem he could solve with a check, and I nodded slowly and said, "Finally, a useful question." And I pulled out my attorney's card and put it on the table. And that card looked like a grenade in the middle of the room, and I said, "I want my name off the loan." And he scoffed, "That's not how it works." And I said, "Actually it is, it just requires you to qualify on your own." And his eyes flickered because he knew he couldn't. He'd been leaning on my income and my credit profile to hold the whole thing together, and I watched him do the mental math of embarrassment, because he's the kind of man who cares more about looking like a provider than actually being one. And Lila spoke up, trying to sound grown. "He can qualify, he makes good money." And my dad's head snapped toward her like, "Shut up." And I smiled because she didn't even realize she'd stepped on a landmine, and I said gently, "If he could qualify, I wouldn't be sitting here." And Lila's eyes got glossy, anger and humiliation mixing together, and she looked at him and said, "You told me you owned the house outright." And he went, "I do own it," which is such a slippery little half-truth it should be illegal. And I said, "Owning it doesn't mean it's paid for." And then I leaned in and asked her, "When he told you you were the lady of the house, did he also tell you the house comes with a monthly payment the size of a small salary?" And my dad barked, Enough, and I held up my hand. No, you said she's the lady. I'm respecting the title. And I watched Lila's confidence crumble into panic because she wasn't ready for bills. She was ready for selfies in the kitchen and couple TikToks and maybe a ring, not the reality of a man who needs his daughter's signature to keep his house. And then my dad tried the oldest trick in the book. He turned to her and said, "Baby, go to the room for a second. This is adult talk." And Lila's head jerked back like she'd just realized the lady of the house crown was made of paper, and she said, "No, I want to know." And my dad's eyes flashed because control slipping makes insecure people mean. And I saw the mask crack for a second, that ugly flicker, and I thought, oh, so this is why he picked a 19-year-old. Because a woman his age would have asked questions. And then he turned back to me and said, "You're trying to ruin my life." And I said, "No, I'm trying to protect mine." And he leaned forward and hissed, "After everything I did for you." And I tilted my head and said, "Like what?" "Exactly, because if we're counting, I've got a spreadsheet." And Lila let out this tiny laugh, like she couldn't help it, like the absurdity cracked through her panic, and then she covered her mouth, and my dad glared at her like she'd betrayed him, and that was the moment I almost felt sorry for her, because he wasn't mad that she laughed, he was mad that she wasn't obedient, and I looked at her and I said, "This is important, so I'm going to be blunt. You don't actually have a problem with me. You have a problem with his secrecy." And she swallowed hard and said, Are you going to, take the house?" And I shrugged. "I don't want the house, I want out." And my dad scoffed again and said, "You can't just walk away." And I said, "Actually, you can, if the person who owns the deed refinances and removes the co-borrower." And then I paused and let that hang, and then I added, "Or if we sell it." And that word, sell, made my dad sit up straight, because to him the house isn't just a building, it's his identity, it's his proof, it's the thing he uses to look respectable while he behaves like a scammer behind closed doors. And he snapped, "I'm not selling my house." And I said, "Then refinance." And he barked, "I can't." And it slipped out too fast, too honest, and Lila's head whipped toward him. "What do you mean you can't?" And he tried to backpedal, "It's complicated." And I said, "It's not complicated, it's expensive." And then Lila stood up, hoodie sleeves hanging past her hands, and she said, "So you can't afford it without her." And my dad's face went red, and he said, "Sit down." And she didn't. And I watched this little power shift happen in real time, because she came in thinking she was replacing me, but now she realized she'd been placed above me only in words, not in value. And she looked at me and said, "Why are you doing this now?" And I wanted to say, "Because you called me about groceries like I'm your assistant," but the truth was deeper, so I said it, "Because you are going to inherit my burden." And she frowned. "What?" And I said, "He would have kept using me until it broke me. Then he would have slid the responsibility over to you as soon as you were old enough to sign something, because that's what he does. He doesn't build stability, he borrows it from women." And my dad shot up off the couch and pointed at me like I'd committed a crime. "Get out of my house." And I didn't move. I just looked at him and said, "This is the first honest thing you've said tonight." And then I picked up my folder slowly, like I had all the time in the world, and I said, "I'll leave. But the situation doesn't leave with me." And he spat, "You're bluffing." And I smiled, because that's what people say right before the consequences arrive, and I said, "I'm not bluffing. I'm documenting." And I walked to the door, and Lila followed me with her eyes like she wanted to ask me 100 questions, but didn't know which one would keep her dignity intact. And as I opened the door, my dad called after me, "If you do this, you're dead to me." And I turned around and said, "That's funny, because you already tried to replace me while I'm still alive." And I stepped out into the night air, and the porch light made everything look too bright and too exposed, and I sat in my car, and my phone buzzed immediately, not a call, a text from an unknown number, and when I opened it, it was a photo of my dad's signature on a document I'd never seen before, with one line highlighted in yellow, and the message under it said, "You might want to read what you actually signed, because the mortgage isn't the only thing your name is on." And my stomach dropped again. Not like before, slower, heavier, because whoever sent that knew something I didn't, and I stared at that highlighted line while the street outside stayed quiet, and I realized the lady of the house. Insult was just the loud distraction, and the real betrayal was hiding in the fine print. waiting for the perfect moment to cash in. Remember not to scatter the lines of the script. Script should all be in straight line. Do not break the lines. Don't say in part 2 or part 3 when finising each part. Just give a seamless curiosity and intrigue and keeps the audience on a loop and leave them wanting more. Note: always satisfy the audience's crave in each part, next part bigger than the last. Note: don't just tell the audience what, show the how it did, without leaving out even the littlest of detail. My hands were still on the steering wheel when that unknown number text hit like a cold coin down the back of my shirt. And the weird thing is the street outside Dad's house looked exactly the same as it always did. Same crooked mailbox, same neighbor's dog that hated everybody equally, same porch light buzzing like it had a personal grudge, and yet my whole life suddenly felt like it had been quietly rewritten while I wasn't looking. And I sat there with my phone glowing in my lap, rereading the message, zooming in on the photo, and my brain kept trying to bargain with reality like, okay, maybe it's spam, maybe it's a scam, maybe it's just somebody being messy, but the signature in the picture looked like my dad's signature, that dramatic swoopy D he always does like he's signing autographs, and the highlight bar was right over a line of text I couldn't fully read, and the more I stared, the more my stomach tightened because I recognized the layout, that cheap legal document. Font, the kind you sign at a kitchen counter while somebody tells you it's just a form, and suddenly every memory in the last 5 years started flashing in reverse like a security camera montage. Me standing in his hallway holding a pen, him saying, "It's just for paperwork," him saying, "It's just to help with the bank," him saying, "Don't worry about the wording, that's just standard." And I realized something that made me feel stupid and furious at the same time. The mortgage drama wasn't new. It was just the first time the mask slipped far enough for me to see the machinery underneath, and I whispered out loud, "What did I sign?" Like the car could answer me, and then my phone buzzed again, and for half a second I thought it would be Dad calling with his usual "get back here and apologize" routine, but it was the unknown number again, another message, no greeting, no explanation, just, "Check your email from 2021, subject. Final copies. You were CC'd," and I swear my heart did that drop thing like when an elevator starts moving before your body expects it, because I did have an email like that. I remembered seeing it late at night, a forwarded chain with PDFs, and I remembered thinking I'll look at it later, and later never came because life is busy and manipulation loves busy people. And I sat there in the car, thumbs shaking, searching my inbox. And then I found it, and the attachment was still there and the file name made my mouth go dry. Durable power of attorney, and right under it, home equity agreement. And I actually laughed once, sharp and ugly, because of course it was power of attorney. Of course it was something that sounds responsible and adult while it quietly hands somebody else the steering wheel to your life. And I clicked, and the PDF took a second to load. And that second felt like my whole body leaning over the edge of a cliff. And then it opened, and the first thing I saw wasn't even the scary part. It was my name typed neatly in black at the top, like I was an employee on a contract. And then I scrolled, and I saw the line that was highlighted in the photo, the exact line. Agent shall have authority to act in all financial matters including but not limited to refinancing, executing liens, and managing obligations in the principal's name. And I felt my face go hot because that wasn't just a mortgage cosign. That was permission, broad permission, permission with no guardrails, and my chest got tight, and my hands went numb, and I kept scrolling because denial still wanted to try, and then I saw it, my signature, and I knew it was mine because I sign my name the same way every time, fast and slightly slanted, like I'm always in a hurry to get on with my life. And I was in a hurry that day. I remembered it now. Dad had called me over because he said there was an issue with the bank, and he needed me to verify identity, and I had gone after work, tired, hungry, still in my blazer. And he'd done that thing where he jokes while you sign so you don't read, "Look at you, Miss Corporate. And don't worry, you're not signing your soul away." And I signed because I trusted him, because he's my dad, because I was raised to believe a father is a safety net, not a trapdoor. And then I saw a second signature line on a different page, not mine, his, and I saw the notary stamp and the date. And I felt like I'd swallowed ice water. And then my phone rang, and it was my best friend Nia. And I answered without even thinking because my brain needed a person, and the second she heard my breathing, she said, "Where are you?" And I didn't even say hello, I just said, "I think my dad made me sign power of attorney." And there was a pause, and then Nia's voice went sharp. "Send it to me right now." And I did. And while it sent, I stared at the street like my vision was trying to find somewhere to put all this. And Nia said, Okay, listen to me, don't go back inside that house tonight, you hear me? And I swallowed. He told me I'm dead to him. And Nia snorted. Men say that when their leverage is slipping, and that hit me leverage because that's what this is, not love, not family leverage, and Nia kept talking. Do you know who sent you that text? And I said, no. And she said, then treat it like a warning, not a friend, and tomorrow you call a lawyer. And I said, I have one. And I looked down at the card I'd put on Dad's coffee table like a grenade. And my stomach twisted because I'd thought I was the one setting the tone, but someone else had been watching this whole time, and I said, Nia, what if he's already used it? And she didn't sugarcoat it. Then we find out what damage is done and we stop more. And the way she said, we made my throat burn because that's what family is supposed to sound like. We, not you, handle it. And then she asked, do you want me to come get you? And I almost said yes, but I was already turning my car key because sitting still felt like drowning. And I said, no, I'm going home. I need to check something. And she said, text me when you're inside and lock your doors. And I hung up and pulled away from the curb, and the second I left that street my body started shaking like it had been holding itself together on pure adrenaline, and I drove with the radio off because I couldn't handle noise. And at every red light, I kept thinking about Lila in that living room, her face cracking open when she realized she wasn't the lady of anything. She was a prop in a story my dad was selling, and I hated him for using her, and I hated her a little for enjoying the title, and I hated myself most of all for ever tying my future to a man who thinks moving on means dragging people behind him like luggage. And when I got to my apartment, I didn't even take off my shoes. I went straight to my little filing box under the TV stand where I keep boring stuff like lease papers and insurance cards, and my hands were clumsy because I was rushing, and I pulled out my credit report printout from last year, and then I opened my laptop and logged into my credit monitoring app, and my heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears, and the page loaded, and at first glance things looked normal, and I almost exhaled. And then I saw an inquiry from 2 months ago I didn't recognize, and then another one, and then a new account listed under open credit, and my mouth went dry because I didn't open a new account, and I clicked into it, and the screen showed a home equity line of credit, and my vision blurred around the edges like my brain was trying to refuse the information, and I stared at the balance, and it wasn't small, it was big enough to make my skin prickle, and I felt this slow, rising anger that wasn't loud, it was quiet, the kind of anger that makes you stop crying because your body is done wasting water. And I said out loud to my empty apartment, he borrowed against me. And I stood there for a second, breathing hard, and then I did the one thing I promised myself I wouldn't do. I called him, and it rang once, twice, and he answered like he'd been waiting. What? And his voice was sharp, and I said, did you open a line of credit in my name? And he laughed like it was offensive that I'd even ask, and he said, don't start. And I said, answer the question. And he went quiet, and then he said, it's not in your name, it's tied to the house. And I said, my name is on the account, Dad. And I heard him inhale, and then he snapped, you're being paranoid. And I almost smiled because that was his favorite move, call the truth a personality flaw. And I said, no, I'm being informed. And he said, you have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, I have the account number on my screen. And there was silence, and then his voice softened, and when a manipulator softens, it's never comfort, it's strategy, and he said, listen, I did what I had to do, things got tight, it was temporary, and I felt my eyes sting, but I didn't let them spill, and I said, temporary, like Lila is temporary, and he snapped, don't bring her into this, and I said, you brought her into my life and called her the lady of the house while you were using your actual daughter like an ATM. And he hissed, you owe me respect. And I said, respect isn't a blank check. And then he did something that made my blood run cold. He said, be careful. You don't want to make this uglier. And my whole body went still, because that wasn't a dad talking. That was a man warning you he knows where the weak spots are. And I said slowly, are you threatening me? And he sighed like I was exhausting. And he said, I'm saying you're emotional, and emotional people make mistakes. And then, like he was flipping channels, he said, if you take my name through the mud, I'll tell people why you're really mad. And I felt my stomach twist because I knew exactly what he meant. He meant he'd paint me as jealous, unstable, bitter. He'd weaponize my tone, my facial expressions, my boundaries, and he'd do it publicly because shame is his favorite leash. And I said, Dad. This is the last time you get to use me. And he laughed again, but it sounded thinner, and he said, "You don't have the stomach for war." And I said, "You're right, I don't. That's why I'm hiring people who do." And I hung up before he could respond, and immediately my hand shook again, and I sat down on my couch, and I stared at my living room wall like it was the only solid thing in the universe, and I thought, okay, what's the move? What's the smartest move? Not the loudest, not the pettiest, the smartest. And I remembered something my therapist told me years ago after my last breakup. When someone has been benefiting from your confusion, clarity will feel like cruelty to them. And I breathed that in, and then I opened my notes app and I started a timeline, because if there's one thing that beats gaslighting, it's documentation, dates, calls, emails, account numbers, and I wrote everything: the lock change, the lady of the house comment, the power of attorney email, the credit inquiries, the helic, and then I called the attorney whose card I'd slid on Dad's table, and it was late, so I left a voicemail that was calm but lethal. "Hi, this is Mara. I need an emergency consult. I just discovered a durable power of attorney signed under pressure, and a helic opened without my informed consent. I need to revoke authority and freeze exposure immediately." And when I said the words out loud, I felt something shift in me. Not peace yet, but direction. And then I texted Nia inside, doors locked, and she replied, "Good, screenshot everything." And I did. I screenshotted until my camera roll looked like a bank detective scrapbook, and then I got another text from the unknown number, and my throat tightened because I didn't like meeting them, but I liked the truth more than I liked comfort, and the message said, "He's going to try to rush you into signing a simple release next. Don't ask who benefits. Ask why now. Also, check the mailbox at the old house. There's something addressed to you he hasn't given you." And my stomach flipped. Mailbox, addressed to me. And I thought about all the ways Dad controls information, like a bouncer at the door of reality, and I imagined a letter sitting there that could change everything, and I also imagined a trap, and my brain started spinning. Who is this number? Is it Lila? Is it Bella? Is it a neighbor? Is it somebody at the bank who feels guilty? And then I remembered Lila's face when she realized the truth, that mix of panic and betrayal, and I thought, she might be young, but she's not stupid, and people do unpredictable things when the fantasy collapses. And then my phone lit up again, and this time it was a message from a known number, my dad, and all it said was, "Come back tomorrow. We'll fix this. Bring your ID." And my stomach dropped because there it was, "Rush you into signing, bring your ID," and my mind flashed to a pen on a kitchen counter, to jokes, to just sign here, and I felt this calm settle in. The kind that comes when you finally accept the game you're in, and I typed back one sentence: "Everything goes through my attorney now," and I watched the little delivered check appear, and then my phone buzzed immediately with his reply, "Don't be stupid," and I stared at that word, stupid, and it hit me like a moral lesson I wish I'd learned at 19 instead of now. People who love you don't need you to be smaller to keep them comfortable. And I didn't respond. I set the phone down and I walked to my kitchen and poured a glass of water because my mouth was dry, and I looked at my reflection in the dark window, and I saw myself, not the little girl who just wanted a dad's approval, not the grown woman who kept hoping family would act like family. I saw a person who finally understood the contract had been rigged, and I thought, okay, tomorrow we don't argue, tomorrow we don't explain, tomorrow we execute. And I went back to my laptop and started drafting an email to my job's HR about a potential identity and credit issue, because I wasn't letting a man with a bruised ego reach into my life like a vandal. And then I heard a soft buzz at my door, like a knock too gentle to be confident, and every hair on my arms lifted because it was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone, and I walked quietly to the peephole, and there, standing in the hallway with a hoodie pulled up and her hands twisting together like she didn't know what to do with them, was Lila, and her mascara was smudged like she'd been crying, and she looked up at the door like she was terrified I'd hate her, and I swear the universe has a sixth sense of timing, because right then my phone buzzed again on the table behind me, and I didn't need to see it to know it was Dad escalating, and I stood there with my hand on the lock thinking, this is either about to become my biggest clue or my biggest headache, and I want you to tell me honestly, if a 19-year-old who helped your parent disrespect you showed up at your door after midnight looking like she'd just learned the truth, would you open it, or would you let her stand there and taste the consequences alone? Because I took one breath, and then I did the one thing my father never expected me to do. I opened the door. I opened the door, and the hallway light poured into my apartment like an interrogation lamp, and there was Lila standing there with her hoodie sleeves pulled down over her hands like she wanted to disappear inside fabric, and she blurted out, "I'm not here to fight you," before I even said a word, and I stood there with my body angled sideways, not inviting, not blocking, just assessing, because I've learned the hard way that people who show up shaking can still be carrying knives you can't see. And my brain was doing that fast math. If she's here, Dad sent her. If Dad sent her, it's a setup. If it's a setup, I'm not giving them another signature, another conversation, another inch. And then Lila swallowed and said, "He doesn't know I'm here." And my stomach tightened because that was either the truth or the most dangerous lie. And I kept my voice low and steady and said, "Why are you here?" And she looked down at her shoes like she was 13 instead of 19 and whispered, "Because I think he used you, and I think he's using me." And there it was, the first crack of honesty, and I didn't soften, I didn't comfort her, I didn't perform empathy like a hall pass. I just stepped back 1 foot and said, "You have 60 seconds. Because boundaries are not a punishment, they're a filter," and she took a shaky breath and rushed the words out like they were burning her tongue. "He told me you were unstable and jealous and that you hated me because you wanted to control him." And I almost laughed because of course that's what he said. When a man is wrong, he doesn't apologize. He drafts a villain, and she continued. "And then tonight he got a call, and he went quiet and he started pacing and he kept saying, 'Who the hell would tell her?' And she can't prove anything." And then he looked at me and said, "If you contact her again, he'll kick you out." And I realized he was talking about me like I was a dog he could rehome, and my jaw clenched because I'd seen that look on Dad's face my whole childhood, the look where people are furniture, the look where love is a lease agreement. And she held out her phone with trembling fingers and said, "I recorded something." And I stared at her screen and my pulse jumped because it was a voice memo and the timestamp was from an hour ago. And my first instinct was to say no because accepting help from the other side feels like drinking from a cup you didn't watch get poured. But then I heard Nia in my head screenshot everything, and I heard my therapist in my head, "Clarity will feel like cruelty to them." And I thought, okay, if she's lying, the recording will show it, and if she's telling the truth, this could be the needle that pops his whole balloon. And I said, "Send it." And she hesitated like she didn't expect me to take her seriously, and then she airdropped it and my phone buzzed, and there it was, and I didn't play it yet. I just looked at her and said, "Why do you care?" And her mouth twisted like she hated herself for the answer. "Because he told me I was special," she whispered. "And then I saw him talk about you like you were a problem in voice." And that hit a weird place in my chest because it wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was pattern, and patterns are easier to fight than feelings. And I stepped aside and let her in just enough to stand inside the doorway, not further, because I don't invite chaos into my living room. I contain it at the entrance, and she kept her eyes down like she was expecting me to spit on her, and I said, "Sit on the chair by the door." And she did, perched like a kid in the principal's office, and I picked up my phone and finally pressed play on the voice memo, and Dad's voice filled the room. Confident, smug, that same tone he uses when he thinks he's the smartest person in the room. "She can't do anything," he said, and then I heard Lila's softer voice, "What if she gets a lawyer?" And Dad laughed, an ugly little chuckle. "Let her. She signed what she signed." And my stomach turned hard because hearing it out loud is different from suspecting it. And then Dad continued, "Power of attorney means I can handle it, refinance it, whatever. She doesn't even read." And I felt heat crawl up my neck because that wasn't just manipulation, that was contempt. And then he said the line that made my hands go cold. "Worst case, I'll say she agreed. She's emotional. She's been emotional since her mother left. People will believe me." And I swear the air in my apartment got heavier because he just dragged my mother into it like a weapon. My mother who died when I was little. My mother whose absence has been his favorite excuse for every bad thing he's ever done. And Lila's voice came again. "But she's your daughter." And Dad snapped, "She's grown." And then, softer, like he was teaching a lesson. "Listen, Lila, adults understand something kids don't. Whoever signs pays, and whoever pays decides." And I stopped the recording because if I listened any longer I was going to do something stupid like drive my car through his living room. And I stood there staring at the wall for a second, breathing through my nose, counting because this is the moment people either explode or execute. And I chose execute, and I looked at Lila and said, "Do you have anything else?" And she nodded fast, dug into her hoodie pocket, and pulled out a folded envelope, and my heart thumped because of the unknown text about the mailbox, and she said, "This came today," and my eyes flicked to the name on the front, my name, Mara Collins, and the return address was the bank, and I didn't touch it yet because my brain was screaming trap, 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 and I said, "Where did you get this?" And she said, "I saw it in the mail pile, and he put it under a cookbook like you were never supposed to see it," and I felt this sharp, satisfied anger because hiding mail addressed to me is not a misunderstanding, it's a tactic, and I took the envelope with 2 fingers like it was contaminated and I checked the seal untouched and I said, "Why didn't you just leave it?" And she swallowed, "Because he said if you found out he'd handle you." And I stared at her, "Handle me how?" And she shook her head, eyes wet. "I don't know, he scares me when he's calm." And that right there, that sentence, that's what people need to understand about predators. They don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper, and I nodded once and said, "Okay," and Lila flinched like she expected me to yell, and I didn't, because yelling is free entertainment for a man like my father, and I said, "I need you to listen carefully," and she nodded, and I said, "You are not the lady of any house," and she looked down, ashamed, and I continued, "You are a teenager he recruited to cosplay adulthood, so he could rewrite the rules," and she whispered, "I didn't know," and I said, "You knew enough to come here." And then I said the part that mattered. "If you want to make this right, you don't do it by apologizing to me. You do it by telling the truth when it counts." And she looked up, blinking, and I asked her, "Are you willing to give a statement if my attorney asks?" And her eyes widened like she hadn't thought that far, and she said, "Will he come after me?" And I told her the truth, "He'll try." And she swallowed hard, and I added, "But trying is different when you have receipts." And then my phone buzzed again, and I didn't even need to look to know it was Dad because he has a way of vibrating into your life like a migraine. And sure enough, the screen lit up with Dad and a message. "Open the door," and my stomach flipped because how did he know? And then another message came in immediately. I saw her leave, and my blood went cold because that meant he was watching the building. And I looked at the peephole, and my body went tense, and Lila whispered, "Oh my God." And I held up a hand to silence her because panic is loud and loud is what he wants. And I walked to the door quietly and looked out, and there he was in the hallway like he owned it, not banging, not shouting, just standing too close to my door with his hands in his pockets and that bored face he uses when he's about to make someone else look crazy. And I could see his jaw working like he was chewing anger, and my phone buzzed again. Don't make me do this the hard way. And I felt this strange calm because the recording was already on my phone, the envelope was already in my hand, and this was no longer a family argument. This was a case, and I stepped back from the door and whispered to Lila, "Go to the bathroom and lock it." And she shot up, scared, and I said, "Now." And she ran, and I opened my camera app and started recording video with the flash off. Because if he wants drama, I'm giving him documentation, and then I unlocked the chain lock just enough to open the door a few inches, and the second the crack appeared, Dad leaned in like a salesman smelling commission. "Where is she?" he demanded, and I kept my voice flat. "You need to leave." And he scoffed, "This is my daughter's place. I can come here if I want." And I almost smiled because he just said the quiet part out loud, ownership, and I said, "You are being recorded." And his eyes flicked quick, calculating, and his tone changed instantly into performance mode. "Mara, what is wrong with you?" he said louder, like he wanted a neighbor to hear. "I'm worried about you, you've been spiraling." And I said, "You mean I've been learning?" And he leaned closer and hissed through his teeth, "Don't you dare." And I lifted the phone a little higher and said, "Say it again." And that's when he saw he couldn't bully me into silence without leaving evidence, and he snapped back into fake calm. "Listen," he said, "we can fix this, you're being emotional." And I said, "You used power of attorney to take a helic and you hid mail from the bank address to me." And his eyes narrowed and his mouth twitched like he wanted to deny it but couldn't decide which lie was safest. And he said, "That's not what happened." And I said, "I have you on recording saying she doesn't even read." And for the first time his mask actually slipped, just a millimeter, enough to show pure panic behind the eyes, and he whispered, "You're going to ruin me." And I said, "You ruined you." And he tried to push the door just a little, testing, and I slammed it shut and locked it fully, chain and all, and my hand shook after because adrenaline doesn't ask permission, and from behind the door I heard him say, not yelling but loud enough for the hallway, "You're ungrateful." And I said back, "And you're exposed." And then it went quiet and I stood there listening. And after a few seconds I heard his footsteps retreat, slow, like he was trying to keep dignity while walking away from a door that wouldn't open for him anymore, and only then did I let myself breathe, and I walked to the bathroom door and said, "He's gone." And Lila opened it an inch, eyes wide, and I said, "You can sit." And she came out like she was stepping off a ledge, and she said, "He's never been like that with me." And I said, "Yes, he has. You just didn't know the language yet." And I sat at my table, opened the bank envelope carefully, and my heart sank, because inside was a notice, formal, cold, important information regarding your obligations, and it listed me as borrower, not just cosigner, borrower, and it included the updated payment terms and a warning about delinquency consequences, and I stared at it and felt my stomach roll because this wasn't just reputational damage, this was real money, real risk, real numbers that could destroy my credit and my future if I didn't move fast. And I looked at Lila and said, "Do you understand what you walked into?" And she nodded, tears slipping, and whispered, "I thought being the lady of the house meant like I mattered." And I said, "It meant he wanted you to believe you mattered so you wouldn't ask why you were there." And then my phone rang and it was my attorney calling back, and I answered immediately and I said, "I have a recording." And I said, "I have hidden bank mail." And I said, "He's outside my door." And my attorney's voice turned crisp. "Do not speak to him again. Do not sign anything. Forward me everything tonight." And I did. And then she said the sentence that made my whole body sit up. "If a durable power of attorney was executed under undue influence or misrepresentation, we can challenge it. And if there's unauthorized borrowing, we can involve the bank's fraud department." And I felt this rush of relief that didn't erase the pain, but did give it a direction. And after the call, I sat there for a second, and I want you to picture this with me. My kitchen light buzzing, the bank letter on my table like a dead fish, the recording on my phone like a loaded weapon, Lila sitting in my chair hugging her knees like she's trying to fold herself small enough to be forgiven, and me realizing that the man I called Dad didn't just disrespect me. He tried to financially collar me. And I need to ask you something right here because this is where the comment section tells the truth. Where are you watching from right now? City and country, because I swear every time I tell a story like this, somebody in another part of the world says, "My uncle did this," or "My mom did this," or "That's exactly how my family talks." And I want to know I'm not screaming into the void. And while you're typing that, tell me this too. If your parent threatened your future with a signature, would you go nuclear or would you still try to keep the peace? Because that phrase, "keep the peace," is how abusers keep the prize. And I looked at Lila and said, "You need to leave before he comes back." And she flinched. "He'll be waiting." And I said, "I'll walk you to an Uber." And she said, "What if he knows where I live?" And I said, "Then you learn what I learned. You don't rely on someone who sees you as leverage." And she whispered, "I can't go back." And I believed her because sometimes the fantasy dies and you can't resurrect it without hating yourself. And I said, "Then you call a friend, a real friend, not a friend he approves." And she nodded, and I got her an Uber, walked her down with my keys between my fingers like claws, and sure enough at the end of the block I saw Dad's car idling like a predator, and my stomach clenched, and I kept my face blank because fear is a treat to men like him. And I guided Lila into the car without looking over, and the driver pulled away, and only then did Dad's car roll forward slow behind us, not close enough to be obvious, just close enough to intimidate. And I stood there on the sidewalk under a flickering street lamp thinking, wow, this man will stalk his own daughter but call it concern. And I went back upstairs, and the second I locked my door my phone buzzed, unknown number again, and it said, "He's panicking because the bank called him today about the helic. He's going to try to get you to sign a revocation that protects him, not you." And I stared at that message, and I thought, who are you? And then another message came. Check the county recorder online for property filings in your name. And my skin prickled, because I hadn't even thought of that. And I opened my laptop and searched the public records portal, and my hands were shaking again, and I typed my name and then my father's address, and the records loaded, and I saw a document filed 3 months ago, quitclaim deed, and my chest went tight like someone had wrapped a belt around it because a quitclaim deed is not a casual form. And I clicked it, and there it was, a scanned copy, and my name appeared again in that ugly typed font, and my stomach dropped because this meant the house wasn't just his. It had been tied to me in a way I did not agree to, and suddenly the title of this whole story snapped into focus like a camera lens. Lady of the house. Mortgage for $150,000, because he wasn't just trying to humiliate me socially, he was trying to offload debt and responsibility onto me while crowning a teenager as queen of the castle, and I sat back in my chair and whispered, "He's trying to make me the fall guy." And that's when my phone buzzed again with a text from Dad. "We're meeting tomorrow. Morning, 9 a.m., bring your ID and be mature." And I stared at it and felt this calm, cold smile creep into my brain because now I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He wanted a signature before I could fully understand the trap. And the funniest part is he still thinks I'm the same version of me. The version that signs to end the argument. The version that thinks being agreeable equals being loved. And I opened my notes app and wrote a list: bank fraud department, revoke POA, restraining order if needed, credit freeze, county recorder alert, and then I opened my email drafts and started writing to my attorney, attaching every screenshot, every record, every message, and then I did one more thing, a tiny petty thing that felt like a pressure release. I renamed my father's contact in my phone from Dad to Douglas Collins, because once you see someone as a legal adversary, the title stops fitting. And I set my phone down and looked around my apartment, and it hit me that this was the first time in my life I wasn't trying to fix him, I was trying to protect me. And that is the moral lesson nobody teaches you as a kid because it sounds harsh until you live it. Sometimes choosing yourself feels like betrayal to people who built their life on betraying you. And I thought I was done for the night. I thought the next move was mourning, lawyers, banks, paperwork, but then there was a knock at my door. Not gentle this time, 3 hard knocks like punctuation, and my whole body went still, and I walked to the peephole and saw a uniform, not police exactly, but building security, and behind him, slightly out of frame, I saw my father's silhouette like a shadow with a pulse, and the security guy spoke through the door. "Ma'am, your father says there's an emergency and you need to come with us." And I felt my blood turn to ice because that wasn't an emergency, that was an ambush with witnesses. And I put my hand on the lock, and I want you to feel this moment with me. The tiny click between safety and chaos, the way your brain races, the way your heart tries to crawl up your throat, because the next choice I made wasn't loud, it wasn't cinematic, it was surgical, and it's the choice that changed who had power in this story. And I need you to stay with me because what I did next is exactly what you do when someone tries to weaponize authority, to drag you back into the cage. The moment I saw the building security uniform through the peephole, I felt my body do that weird survival thing where everything goes quiet except your heartbeat and the voice in your head that says, "Don't open it, don't open it, don't open it," because this wasn't help and it wasn't concern and it definitely wasn't family. This was Douglas trying to borrow credibility the way he borrows money, by putting someone official looking between himself and the consequences, and I kept my hand on the lock, but I didn't turn it. I took one step back and spoke through the door in a calm voice that didn't match the way my palms were sweating. "What emergency?" And the security guy cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am, your father said you're refusing to come to a meeting and there's a legal issue with the apartment and he needs you to verify something." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was classic. When Douglas wants to break into your boundary, he doesn't kick the door down. He pretends the door is paperwork, and behind the guard I heard my father's voice, slightly raised, not yelling, just loud enough to sound reasonable to a third party. "Mara, stop doing this, you're scaring people, just open the door." And my jaw tightened, because notice the language. I'm not scared, people are. He's always outsourcing my emotional state to the room, and I said through the door, "There is no legal issue with my apartment, and if there is, you can slide any written notice under the door." And Douglas scoffed like I was being difficult on purpose. "See, this is what I mean. She's spiraling." And the guard shifted uncomfortably because even he could feel how weird this was, and I said, "Sir," speaking directly to the guard now, "my father does not live here. He is not on my lease, and he has no authority to demand I open my door. If you need to verify anything, call your supervisor, and I'll speak to them on speaker through the door." And Douglas snapped, "Don't be dramatic, I'm trying to keep you safe." And I said, "Safe from what?" "My own front door." And there was a pause, a thick one, because when you ask a manipulator a specific question, they either change the subject or expose themselves, and Douglas chose option 2. He leaned closer to the door so his voice dropped into that intimate threat tone, the one meant for me, not the guard. "If you don't come out, I'll tell them you're unstable and they'll do a wellness check." And my stomach Rolled because there it was, the weaponized help, the fake concern that gets you restrained, embarrassed, controlled. And I didn't argue, I didn't plead, I didn't explain my mental stability like I was on trial. I did what you do when someone tries to bait you into an emotional dance. I went legal and boring. I grabbed my phone, hit record again, and said clearly, Douglas Collins is threatening to use a false wellness check to force entry and intimidate me, and the guard's posture changed. Instantly, because no one wants to be caught in the middle of that, and Douglas barked, "Stop recording, this is family," and I said, "Family doesn't require uniform." And then I did the most annoying thing you can do to a controlling person. I called their bluff with an audience. I said to the guard, "Would you like me to call the police myself and report harassment, or will you escort him off the property?" And Douglas hissed, "You wouldn't," and I said, "Try me," and the guard looked over his shoulder at Douglas like he was realizing he'd been used as a prop, and he said, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the door," and Douglas's voice jumped into that fake laugh. "Oh, come on, I'm her father," and the guard held his ground. "That doesn't matter. She asked you to leave," and Douglas's face, the part one could see through the peephole, did that micro flash of rage, like a mask slipping, because he hates being told no by anyone with a badge, and he muttered, "Fine." But then he couldn't resist one last jab, loud enough for the guard to hear. "You see what I deal with? She's been like this since her mother died," and I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't give him the reaction, because grief is not his talking point, and I said through the door, "Do not mention my mother again." And the guard finally stepped between him and my door, and Douglas backed up, but not far, just enough to look like he was complying while still controlling the space, and the guard said, "Ma'am, are you okay?" And I said, "I'm safe. I'm being harassed, please document this." And the guard nodded like he'd already decided whose story made sense, and then the hallway quieted as they walked away. And I waited until the elevator dinged shut, because experience teaches you that manipulators love to double back when they think you relaxed. And then I slid down my door for 1 second, and let the adrenaline shake run through me like electricity. And then I stood up because shaking is fine, but stopping is not, and I texted my attorney one sentence. He tried to force contact using building security and threatened a wellness check. And I attached the video, and then I did the second smartest thing I've done in this whole mess. I called the building manager, not to complain like a victim, but to set a boundary like a tenant, and when she answered, I kept it short and sharp. "My father is not permitted on the property. If he returns, do not call my unit to verify. Call police for trespass." And she went quiet and said, "Did he say he was family?" And I said, "Yes, and he's using staff to intimidate me." And she sighed like she'd heard similar stories. "Understood. I'll put an alert on your unit." And I thanked her and hung up, and only then did I open my laptop again and go back to that quitclaim deed, because the more I looked at it, the more my skin crawled. There was a signature that looked like mine but wasn't mine. It had the shape of my name, but the rhythm was wrong, like someone tracing a map without knowing the streets. And I zoomed in, and my throat went dry because it wasn't just a document. It was a crime. And that's when my attorney called back, voice tight. "Mara, I just listened to the recording you sent earlier, and I reviewed the bank notice. And this is bigger than a family dispute. I need you to freeze your credit tonight, all 3 bureaus, and I need you to file an identity theft report if any signature was forged." And I felt my stomach drop because identity theft sounds like something that happens to strangers in documentaries. "Not to you, because your father wanted to impress a 19-year-old. And I said, "He forged my signature." And she said, "We can't say forged until we confirm, but yes, we treat it like that." And then she added, "Also, I want to be crystal clear. Do not meet him tomorrow. Do not go to any bank. Do not go to any notary. Do not just sign to make it go away, because that's what he's counting on." And I stare at my kitchen wall as she spoke, because she just described my old self like she'd been watching my life. The self that thinks peace is worth any price. And I said, "What do I do now?" And she said, "Now we build the paper trail, and we cut off his leverage." And then she gave me a checklist like a surgeon. File a police report for harassment if he returns. Request the bank's fraud investigation unit. Request a copy of the power of attorney file and the notarization details. Request the HELIC application package. Submit a written revocation of any POA you signed if it's valid, and if it's not valid, we challenge it. And then she said something that hit harder than everything else. "You need to emotionally prepare for him to smear you. Because when people lose control, they don't suddenly discover morality, they discover strategy. And I swallowed because I already felt that strategy in the hallway, the "she's unstable" line, the wellness check threat, and I said, "He's going to say I'm jealous of the girl," and my attorney's voice was flat. "Let him. The truth is stronger than gossip when you have documents." And that word gossip stuck in my head, because that's what Douglas does best. He turns every problem into a story where he's the hero and you're the villain and the audience is forced to clap. And I thought about Lila, how she showed up shaking because the fairy tale rotted in her hands, and I realized Douglas didn't want a partner. He wanted a witness, someone young enough to be impressed and naive enough to call it love. And I sat at my table and did the credit freezes one by one, answering security questions that felt like trivia about my own life. And I filed alerts, and I printed the quitclaim deed, and I highlighted the parts that referenced me, and I opened my banking app and saw the Helic payment schedule, and I felt that familiar flash of rage. Not wild rage, clean rage, the kind that organizes your spine, because I knew why he called her lady of the house. He wasn't crowning her, he was distracting everyone while he shoved the bill at me, and then my phone buzzed again. "Douglas, we're still meeting, you can't dodge this forever." And I didn't respond, and then another message, "If you don't come, I'll have the bank call you." And I still didn't respond, and then another, "Stop acting like a victim, you signed it." And my hands went cold because he was already laying the groundwork. His whole defense was going to be, "She agreed. She's dramatic. She regrets it." And I realized something that I want you to hear, because it's the educational part nobody teaches in families like this. Your abuser doesn't need you to be wrong, they just need you to be unclear, because unclear is where they hide. So I made myself painfully clear in one single move. I replied one sentence, and then I shut my phone off. "Do not contact me directly. All communication goes through my attorney." And within seconds he called, and I let it ring, and then he called again and again, and my stomach did that flutter, because your body remembers childhood. It remembers the consequences of defiance, but my brain was older now, and older brains choose consequences they can live with, and I turned my phone off completely, and I sat in the silence, and I swear the silence felt different, like it belonged to me. And then I heard a faint sound at my door again, not knocking, something softer, like paper brushing the floor, and my heart jumped because of course he wasn't done. And I walked slowly, and I looked down and saw an envelope shoved under my door. No stamp, no return address, just my name written in thick black marker, like a warning, and I didn't touch it immediately, because I've learned that desperate people do desperate things. And then my laptop pinged with a new email from an unfamiliar address, and the subject line was, "You don't know the whole truth about your mother." And my throat went tight, because that's the oldest hook in his playbook. Take the one wound you have and press it until you bleed. And I stood there in my hallway staring at the email subject, staring at that envelope, feeling the trap close in two directions at once. And I need you to understand what that means. Because this wasn't just money anymore, this was him trying to rewrite my past to control my future, and I had to decide in that moment whether I was going to open the envelope and let him drag me into the emotional swamp, or ignore it and stay on the legal road that actually ends with freedom. And the choice I made next is the reason this whole story stops being dad dates teen and becomes dad loses everything he thought he owned. I didn't open the envelope right away because I know how this works. The minute you touch the bait, you're not standing in your hallway anymore, you're standing in their courtroom. And then you're explaining yourself to a person who already decided your guilt. So I grabbed a clean grocery bag like it was a hazardous sample, and I slid the envelope into it without letting my skin touch the paper. And then I took a photo of it on my kitchen table from 3 angles like some broke CSI. And then I texted my attorney. He left an unmarked envelope and sent a manipulation email about my mother. And then I sat there staring at the subject line again, because it wasn't just a message, it was a pressure point. My mother's name has been the lever Douglas uses when he's losing, and then I heard my own breath and realized I was doing that shallow inhale thing like I was bracing for impact, and then I forced myself to do the boring, smart thing. I forwarded the email to my attorney without opening it, and I wrote back to that address, one sentence only. Do not contact me. All communication is through counsel. And then I blocked it, and then my phone stayed off, and then for the first time in this whole circus the silence didn't feel like loneliness, it felt like control. And then my doorbell camera pinged because yes, of course, he came back, and on the tiny screen I saw him standing there with Lila beside him like she was a prop in a commercial, her hair curled, her makeup perfect, her posture too stiff for a 19-year-old who's in love. And Douglas looked straight at the camera and smiled like a man who thinks cameras are for performance, not evidence. And then he held up a folder and mouthed the words, "Open up." And then Lila leaned in and said something I couldn't hear, but I could read her lips. "Please." And that's the part that would have wrecked the old me, because it's so easy to confuse a soft voice with innocence. But my brain had already done the math. She wasn't knocking because she cared about me. She was knocking because the fantasy house was collapsing. And she needed someone to blame that wasn't the man she moved in with. So I didn't open the door, I didn't even speak. I just hit record on the app and I watched. And then Douglas did what men like him always do when the sweet approach fails. His face hardened and he started talking louder so the neighbors could hear. "Mara, stop hiding. You can't do this to your family." And I felt that familiar spike of anger, because look how he always says family when he means free labor. And then Lila tried. Again, softer, palms out like she was the peacekeeper. "I'm not here to fight. I just need to understand." And I actually whispered to myself, "No, you don't. Because understanding isn't a requirement for leaving someone's mortgage alone." And then Douglas knocked hard 3 times. And then he said the line I knew was coming, because it's the only card he has left. "I'm going to call the police and tell them you're having a breakdown." And right there, I want you to pause and tell me what you would do, because this is the moment a lot of people fold. They open the door out of fear, and then they get dragged into a scene, and then the story becomes she's unstable instead of he's abusive. So I did the opposite. I called the police myself from inside my apartment, calm voice, clean facts. "My estranged father is outside my door threatening a false wellness check to force contact. I'm safe. I'm requesting a trespass warning." And then I stayed quiet and let the Ring camera keep filming. And then Douglas's confidence started to flicker, because bullies hate when you bring real authority instead of the pretend authority they use to scare you. And then, because he cannot stand losing an audience, he did something so childish it would be funny if it wasn't attached to my life. He turned to Lila and said loud enough for the hallway to hear, "See, this is what she does. She makes everything legal. She always hated me." And Lila looked at him like she'd been handed a script she didn't fully memorize, and then she said the one thing that told me she wasn't just a victim in his story. She was learning his tactics fast. She looked at the camera and said, "She's lying. He's my husband now. I'm the lady of the house." And I swear my whole body went cold hot, because did you catch that? Husband. Not boyfriend, not fiancé, husband. And then I heard my attorney's earlier words in my head. When people lose control, they discover strategy, and I realized Douglas wasn't just dating a teenager for ego. He was building a legal shield out of her. And then the police arrived and my door camera caught everything. The officer spoke to Douglas first, Douglas performing concern. "I'm worried about my daughter. She's been irrational." And then the officer knocked on my door, and I didn't open it, I spoke through it. "Officer, I'm safe. I'm requesting a trespass notice. My attorney is aware. I have recordings of threats." And the tone changed instantly, because cops here. The difference between drama and documentation. And then the officer asked Douglas for identification and asked his relationship to the property, and Douglas said, "Family," and the officer said, "That doesn't give you access." And then he asked Lila who she was, and she puffed up like a cartoon villain in a silk robe. "I live here. I'm his wife." And the officer asked, "Do you have ID matching this address?" And she froze for half a second, and then she said, "I'm new." And the officer nodded. Like, "Okay, got it." And then he told him plainly, "She's requesting no contact, you need to leave." And Douglas tried one last push. "But the mortgage," and the officer cut him off. "Not my issue, handle it in court." And Douglas's mouth tightened, because court is where the truth lives, and he prefers the kitchen table where he can guilt you. And then they left. And when the elevator doors closed, I finally exhaled like my lungs had been holding their breath for a week. And then I did the next boring step. I emailed my attorney the police report number and the recordings, and then she called me and said, "Good, now we escalate properly." And then the real reversal began. Not a screaming match, not a revenge speech. Paperwork, because paperwork is the adult version of a boundary. And then we requested the full loan file from the bank and the notarization logs. And then the bank's fraud unit flagged inconsistencies. And then they asked for a handwriting sample. And then I went in with my attorney and signed my name 5 times in front of a bank investigator. And then the investigator held up the deed with a fake signature and didn't even look dramatic about it. She just said quietly, "This doesn't match." And I felt this weird mix of relief and grief because relief means you're not crazy and grief means you were never crazy. You were just surrounded by people who benefited from you doubting yourself. And then my attorney filed an emergency motion to suspend enforcement of the HELIC against me pending investigation, and then we filed to revoke any claimed power of attorney, and then we filed a restraining order based on harassment and threats of false wellness checks. And then the first domino fell in a place I didn't expect, Lila, because once the bank started sniffing around, the fantasy stopped being cute and started being scary, and then she messaged me from a new number, not Douglas's phone, hers, and the text said, "I didn't know he used your name," and I stared at it for a full minute because I could hear two possible realities in that sentence. Either she was lying to protect herself or she was telling the truth, because the moment a teenager realizes she's married to fraud, she suddenly remembers she's 19. And then I replied the only honest thing I could. "You don't get to be lady of the house and also claim you don't know how the bills got paid." And then she sent back, "He said you promised." And I laughed once, a sharp, ugly laugh. Because of course he did, and I typed, "Ask him why he threatened to call in a wellness check to force me to sign." And then she went silent. And then 2 days later the next domino fell. Douglas called my attorney screaming because the bank froze the refinance process and the mortgage rate adjustment hit like a brick. And then he panicked because the payment jumped. And then he tried to reframe it as my fault. And my attorney said something I will replay in my head forever. "Sir, your daughter did not create your debt." She refused to continue being trapped by it. And then he did what men like Douglas always do when the system doesn't bend. He tried to bargain with emotion. He sent a handwritten letter to my attorney addressed to me, dripping with "I raised you and after everything I've done and family." And there was one line that made my hands shake with rage. "If you loved me, you'd help me." And I want you to tell me in the comments right now, is that love or is that extortion wearing a dad costume? Because to me, love is a safety net, not a leash. And then I made the move that ended the whole game. I signed a legal affidavit stating I never consented to any new debt, and I never authorized any transfers, and I wanted full investigation and prosecution if forgery was confirmed. And then the bank's fraud investigator thanked me for being precise, and then my attorney said, "This is what closes the trap." And then Douglas's world shrank, because when you stop being available, manipulators don't suddenly become better people. They run out of exits. And then he showed up one last time, not at my door this time, at my work, because he knew I wouldn't want a scene in public, and he caught me walking to my car, and he stepped in front of me and said, "You're really going to do this?" And I looked at him and I noticed something small but important. He looked older, not because of age, because of consequences, and I said, "You did this." And he scoffed. "I did what I had to do." And I said, "Exactly." And then I stepped around him and got in my car and locked the door. And then he leaned on my window and hissed, "She's young. She doesn't understand. You're ruining my life." And I rolled the window down 2 inches, just enough for my voice to land. And I said, "You made her lady of the house. Let her be lady of the mortgage." And I rolled it back up and drove away. And my hands were shaking, but my spine felt straight. And then I got home and sat on my couch and cried for a minute, not because I missed him, because I missed the idea of a father, and then I wiped my face and did the moral lesson part out loud like I was teaching myself. If someone can't respect your no, they don't love you, they need you. And then I thought about you watching this, because I know some of you are living inside a family where love is a bill and boundaries are punishable, and I need you to hear this. You can be kind and still be done. You can be compassionate and still refuse to drown. You can be someone's child and still not be their collateral. So here's my question. If your parent crowned a teenager lady of the house while expecting you to pay the mortgage, would you cut them off, sue them, or expose them publicly? And don't be polite. I want the real answer. And if you've ever had a family member try to ruin your reputation to control your money, comment, "Not collateral," so other people in this thread know they're not alone. And then listen, the reason you need to stay with me too the very end of this series is because the biggest twist isn't even the mortgage. It's what I found inside that unmarked envelope after my attorney opened it with gloves, and it's the one thing Douglas never thought I'd verify. So if you want that reveal, and you want the exact steps I used to protect myself without becoming the villain in a story, go watch the next video, because that's where the nice daughter version of me dies for good, and the free version finally gets to live.